I'm Katie Bennett-Stenton, a senior B2B marketing professional with a real interest in digital transformation, change management, and developing amazing content. I live in Melbourne, Australia with my husband and two mostly delightful children. Having worked in senior marketing roles in the UK, US and Australia, I've met many inspiring people and benefited hugely from the power of network and community. In this Katie Talks podcast series, I uncover the stories of influencers sharing their thought-provoking business and leadership insights. Today, I'm talking with Stella Voules, Organisational Psychologist, or as she rather delightfully says, cultural change whisperer, leadership developer, board capability advisor, co-CEO of Juiced, and beekeeper. Stella's LinkedIn bio says that she operates at the intersection of people and change, the psychology of behaviour and organisational change. I first met Stella about 14 years ago when she was working at Mercer, and she's had a really interesting career path since then. Stella, welcome.
Oh, hello. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too.
And I'm not sure I've done your varied and impressive background justice. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, look, I think you summed it up nicely. The only thing that I would probably add is that my most challenging role to date has been my most recent one of beekeeper. And it probably has demanded a really, really interesting need for a focus on my values, which I didn't expect. So,
That's fascinating. How so, before we get into
well,
the slightly more...
I just thought that, we've got some property down in regional Victoria, and I thought, we need something that doesn't need a whole lot of maintenance. Bees sounded a great idea. We'll collect some honey, simple.
Yeah.
But no, there's lots of decisions you need to make about life and death and all sorts of things related to beekeeping. So, it's been more challenging than I anticipated.
Well, I think that sounds very interesting. Excellent. Now, Stella, you're doing a lot in the leadership development space and looking particularly at how our expectations of the way that a leader behaves is evolving. I'm really keen for you to explore this.
Yeah, look, I think this is a really interesting space that's been evolving probably for the last decade or so. And there's this increase in access and transparency. And, I really like the coined term around the democratization of knowledge, which I think sits behind it, where it's, the action of making something accessible to everyone. And, I think its roots are very much in Silicon Valley, where, the tech giants are almost a modern day version of our flower power children. They anti-establishment, this counterculture of breaking the rules, and so it spawned this notion of open source, open access, where there's access to data and code frames and analytics and templates, and this is kind of really powerful stuff. And I'm fascinated by this movement because I see it as the bedrock of disruption and innovation. And so we have things like Wikipedia and, WikiLeaks, really controversial stuff coming out of it. But likewise, we also have, Canva, who's made graphic design accessible to everyone. We have Culture Amp, who's made statistics accessible to everyone. We have Xero, who's made bookkeeping accessible to everybody. All these things that are very low cost.
Yes.
And likewise, I think that in organisations, this movement has created a shift in the power dynamic where there's a shared leadership platform with employees where influence is more accessible to everyone. And I think that, employees have a voice more so than they have ever had now. And I think leaders are expected to listen and to empathise and to the point where their performance is actually now evaluated on these things, sometimes even more than what they actually deliver.
Sure. Well, that's a massive change.
Absolutely. It's given rise to things like inclusive, more diverse cultures, more authentic leadership. And I think that leaders are held to a higher account a higher order level than they have before, where things like social and ethical values are wound into their performance above, what we expect of them in the past. And they're expected to be able to tap into the zeitgeist of today and respond to it. And I think all of that coincides with what we now understand around trust.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So, if you look at just this year's Edelman Trust Barometer,
yes,
we see that people trust their employer over and above the government and the media. And we see that people trust my employer at 77% compared to the government at 42% and the media at 40%. It's a chasm.
That's a phenomenal
in between.
difference. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that there's this shift in terms of trusting relationships that they can control.
Okay.
And so what employers are actually able to do is amplify this, because it's it's very much a strength for employers to be able to tap into. And they'll be rewarded for doing that. Australian employees, we know, when you correlate trust, it also delivers higher rates of advocacy, higher rates of loyalty, higher rates of engagement, higher rates of commitment. And so to be able to build on and maintain this trust is a really important thing that leaders need to be able to do.
I was going to ask you whether, from an employee's perspective, I think that more transparency is a fantastic thing. I was going to ask you more broadly, with your expertise as an organisational psychologist, whether it is, but all of those things that you just mentioned are absolutely the kind of thing that employers seek to foster, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's there's a collective say now in terms of what's important around here.
Sure.
How we operate, what we invest in.
Yeah.
We can see organisations actually taking a stand on social issues, almost like activists, which we haven't seen before. Oricon has cut ties with Adani. Qantas is a crusader for social justice and marriage equality. NAB recently announced that they're not funding organisations which have ties with animal cruelty. You're going climate change, veganism, dogs at work.
Yes.
So there's this shift of actually creating a more open environment where people bring themselves to work.
Yeah.
And what they believe in and what they consider important is something that leaders need to really importantly tap into in order to be able to navigate through the future of work.
Such a fascinating topic. This one could very, very easily fill a full hour podcast. Sort of building on that, Stella, we're asking a lot of employees these days, aren't we? Not only to deliver on their work, but to change the way they do things, new ways of doing things, often doing more with less. And, we read in the media that we're seeing increased levels of anxiety, exhaustion, stress, and many organisations are turning to meditation and helping build resilience as a solution for their employees. As we encourage people to bring their whole selves to work to counter that push to automation. Sorry, that is a very long question. But what I'm getting to here is I'm interested to understand your views and thoughts around that whole nature versus nurture theme, and whether empathy can be learned and whether we can build empathetic cultures within organisations.
Yeah, I think that's quite a important question. I actually don't think it's an option anymore. I think that we have to build more empathic cultures. I think it's the only way that you can sustain performance in terms of the new demands on organisations. I think that there's a perfect storm happening at the moment where we have the pace of work due to technology intersecting with the pace of change due to the new ways of working. In that mix, I think we have higher rates of loneliness, which we know are as toxic on us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And we have skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety in the community. And that creates a perfect mix for issues. And so I think that we do demand a lot from people, and that it's important for us to make sure that we balance the outputs with the inputs, that we remind people to pace themselves, to take their leave, to reach out and connect with others for support. As leaders, to look for the symptoms, to be able to have intervene and have those conversations. You know, Stella, geez, I've noticed that you're working really long hours. Is everything okay? What's going on? And to also carefully consider our own the tone that we set as leaders also. I'm quite hyper-conscious of this in terms of our business, because we're quite virtual and fluid, and it's really easy for me to be able to use that technology unintentionally, just through my stream of thought, and send set a tone which isn't my intent. So, and that might be okay with my business partner Joe, who can kind of go, oh, you know, it's quite late and Stella's thinking, and that's okay. I'll park it till tomorrow. But you know, people in my team, there's a power differential, and so the receipt of something like that would be creating anxiety, and actually have a less constructive impact than I would desire. So I think that it's important to stay quite conscious of that. And empathy can absolutely be learnt, and but it's something that we have to consciously remember to do.
Okay.
So we know that, you know, through neuroscience, that we have a series of mirror neurons in our brain, which means that as soon as we spend some time together, there's this infection that happens in terms of our feelings. And so if someone's hurt or if someone's happy, you'll feel that in their presence. And so, and this creates almost like a neural Wi-Fi with everybody around us. And so that's why it's so important to connect with each other, and hence why having quite an empathic culture is critical. And you know, we know that the large majority of us have the capacity to be empathic.
Okay.
And so therefore actually learning how to do that in a way that's demonstrable is possible and is important.
So how does one teach or learn to be more empathetic?
Spending time with people and listening. It's that dyadic relationship that's important. So as a leader, you know, parting the ocean and actually physically or virtually coming together with people one-on-one, small teams, as often as you can, is actually what's going to trigger that empathic response, because you'll understand that person, that small team, those issues at a far deeper level than you would if you don't actually actively participate in those behaviours.
And is something about, or is there an element about talking a little bit about what's happening outside of work, or getting to know, well, we talked about the whole person. Is there an element of that contribute? Yeah,
look, absolutely. I think that most employees these days would actually expect their leader to be interested in them beyond what they're delivering on their project or in their team.
It's such a fascinating conversation to me. I mean, I long time ago had a manager who was not interested in talking about anything outside of work, even if it had been brought to said manager's attention that, you know, something really significant was happening and incredibly stressful happening outside of the office, and I had a really sick member of my immediate family, so I had a lot going on, and we ultimately sort of ended up having a conversation, and I sort of said, look, why don't we talk about that? You know, I would have thought that might be something that you might ask me, and my manager said, oh, well, look, it's private. I assumed that you would not want to talk about it at work, and then if you needed help, you would ask. Yeah. And that was many years ago, but it was just really made me stop and think and wonder whether what I was looking for and hoping for was something that wasn't reasonable in a workplace. Yeah. It was really interesting.
Yeah. I think it's a bit of a hangover of an older school of thought.
Sure.
In terms of how to succeed at a senior level.
Yeah.
Far more compartmentalised approach.
Sure.
That this is work and this is home.
Yeah.
And you turn off your computer and you go home and you come back in the morning and these things are separate.
Yeah.
And I think that there's been a maturation process that's happened to us as human beings.
Sure.
That we've gone, that may have made sense then.
Yeah.
But over the last decade or so, things are different now. And there is, emerging and a fluidity to our identity and who we are and what we do. And it taps into, the growing need of people needing to feel like what they do has some meaning.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that's a great way to articulate it. Because, I like to talk about having a balanced life or seeking a balanced life rather than work-life balance. Because I don't think that they're compartmentalised. If things are great in one area, then of course that's going to bleed into and influence the other. And conversely, when things are not going so well in one area, I think that typically impacts the other part as well.
And but there are people who are more introverted and a little bit more private than others, and as a leader, I think it's about understanding what the boundaries are for those people. Yeah. And that being okay, but at the same time, sometimes you actually do need to get a little bit closer than you would to others to find out the same information you need about what motivates that person and what makes them tick.
Yeah, well, that's so important, isn't it? In sort of all facets.
Yeah.
Stella, you did the Australian Institute of Company Directors course about 7 years ago. And I know from the conversation that we'd had before we started recording that you said at the time the subject or area of culture was included in that course, but that it was really new. And you talked about having some awakenings as a result of that. I'm really interested to explore this and to hear some more about that, please.
It was, I can't remember, sort of 7 or 8 years ago that I did the IACD program, and I was both satisfied and surprised to actually see culture on the agenda at the time. I think since then it's evolved, obviously, and also become quite heightened with the Royal Commission into banking. And I think that it's something that's always been in the DNA of my thinking. And, I throw back to, when you and I first met when I was at Mercer, and a lot of the work that I did there in terms of mergers and acquisitions and looking to connect the dots between, the board and culture and why the attraction to this particular acquisition. And then, well, what are the potential cultural pitfalls at the due diligence and integration levels? And, doing that work back then sort of was another plank in this. And I've also, in my work, seen how executives teams attempt to manage their relationship with the board, sometimes to the detriment of the organisation, where I think good ideas can sometimes be held back because there's a perception that the board's going to be too conservative, that there might be reputational harm in terms of taking something that's too progressive, and I think that's plays into this notion of psychological safety, that it's actually not just an issue that affects our employees, but also executives when they're facing into board environments sometimes. And I think that that's an unintended consequence. And so I think that, around our earlier conversation about the democratization of things, I think that there's also a democratization of influence happening at the board level.
Okay.
And that I think that there's a debate being had about, is its purpose, should its purpose be to respond to shareholders?
Yes.
Or is it actually bigger and broader than that? Is this organisation something that's greater than simply a profit-making entity? Is it a social enterprise? And that hasn't been settled yet. These are conversations that are being had, and this is actually about influence. Are they accountable to the communities that they serve also?
Yes.
And so I think that what kind of got board members into the boardroom in the past, which was a lot about their industry, technical prowess, isn't necessarily what's going to be the what's going to define the future. And that I think that there's something about director capability around managing relationships and understanding the intended and unintended impact of their behaviour on each other, on the executive, on the sector that they operate in. And so I think it's an evolving space and an important one. And I think for boards to sort of further develop better insight and understanding around the capability of themselves in this space is a fabulous place to start.
It's a topic that's really interesting to me. I mean, having spent a lot of the last 6 years focusing quite heavily around the energy and resources space, this is very much a conversation that has been evolving and quite quickly, to my mind, that, as you say, the typical, or many people in the community used to view the purpose of organisations as largely as being responsible or existing to support their shareholders or for their shareholders' benefit. And this growing, groundswell of the fact that that's not really by many considered to be good enough anymore. It's that you operate with integrity. And, if you look at some of the marches and the protests that have been happening around the world, it's a lot of younger people, students who can't yet vote, don't yet have jobs, but they're having a really firm say in terms of trying to bring to the global consciousness a whole lot of other issues, which is really interesting. And as they start to be able to vote and have money and influence, the economy even more, I think we're going to see a whole lot of change. So it's interesting to sort of hear you talk about that. I guess this perhaps more as a top-down approach?
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Yeah, that's how I see it. It's, and I think that it is an evolutionary piece in terms of organisational structure, governance, impact, connection.
Yeah, okay. So if we were to grab your crystal ball and gaze ahead 10, 20 years, what would you expect or what might you guess the AICD course might cover in terms of culture? Would you expect perhaps that it would be more significant than today?
Look, absolutely. I think it will be far more significant. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, that's a really interesting case study in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, famous last words.
Quite. We'll revisit that in a few years, Stella. The work that you've been doing is a lot around challenging some well-established norms. I'm really interested to know how you stay at the cusp of new and different, especially in the people and culture space.
I really like to go out to the fringes. I like to go hard right and hard left and then land somewhere in the middle. And, that middle varies from client to client. Depends on the context. You talked about crystal balls a minute ago, and I'm a huge fan of futurists. I think that I listen to many of them, and they really do have profound insight in terms of, what's coming and help us to prepare. I was listening to a podcast just the other day where there was, it was actually about an organisation which attracts incredible talent and then just ingests them. So they don't actually even draft a job description. They take them in and then they drop them in and allow them to float for around about 3 months and allow them to turn over every stone, talk to as many people as possible, explore every project, understand how we function around here, how we make money, how we succeed and how we operate, and then work out where you think that you can add the most value and be the best you can be.
That's fascinating.
Isn't it fascinating?
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that there's too many Australian organisations who are ready to take on a model like that. But you know what? You look at that and you listen to that and you go, you know what, that could work. Why not? Right? So I think that being inspired by thinkers who are broad and far and wide, and then bringing it back to what makes sense for us today and here is what I love to do. What I don't like to do is a copycat technique. I don't like. Sometimes I might see this attempt to copy some of the big techs. They have really deep pockets. Yes. And they also have operated in spaces which have been quite liberal in terms of regulation as well. And so they could be really creative and play with lots of things.
Much more scope.
Yeah. And, I've seen some organisations lately undoing agile in some parts of their business. And
really,
I've seen some organisations stepping away from the fail fast mantra.
Because they are two catch cries that you hear, that I reckon I hear just about any conversation or any conference or professional development that I attend.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a time and a place for it. There are times and places where it works really, really well, and then others where it doesn't. And so I think it's just using judgment around what's actually appropriate.
Okay.
And what makes sense for us. I think I also really like to get out in the front of things and play with new ideas. So, we started to play with design thinking, for example, quite early on, and weave it through a lot of the work that we do now. Okay. I think it's a fabulous way to force creativity into a traditional process and a very, very engaging way to get people connected into something. Playing with things like behavioural economics around what can we take from this and actually apply to our craft. And I think, ultimately I do like to try and get in early. So I like to appear in places where cultural awareness is kind of early days. So, for example, one of our earliest clients was a startup cosmetics industry, two co-founders out of Mecca, and designed a sunscreen for millennials, facial sunscreen for millennials.
And why made it for millennials?
Education.
Okay.
Yeah, so taking a really strong educational stance in terms of skin protection very early on.
Yeah.
And so, and they needed seed funding to manufacture product to take it to market. And so they weren't interested in going down the VC path, but had found a third equity partner who would inject some of the funding that they needed to be able to go to the next stage. Yeah. And so the work that we did with them was actually about cultural forecasting, and
what is that?
And spoke to and worked with the two co-founders in terms of what is the organisation that you want to create going to be about. What does that potentially look like, or what does it mean? And so doing that work with them, we then conducted the assessment of the option of a third equity partner. Okay. And then spoke to them about how it would shift what it is that they wanted to create from a cultural point of view. And based on the advice, they actually didn't go down that path. They left the money on the table, and they funded they self-funded and have been incredibly successful. So you look up Ultraviolet, and you'll see that it's become a cult brand in Vogue now.
Okay.
And they're building an organisation which they love, and which the two co-founders completely own themselves. I turn up to cybersecurity conferences, and every time I do that, I get asked, "What the heck are you doing there? You've got people in HR."
And what are you doing there? What are you doing there, Stella?
Again, the issues there are very much about culture.
Yes.
How it's playing out in organisations,
Yes.
and how those teams need to be working together. And the cultural awareness is far more important to them than the next software and gadget that they're buying. And so, getting out the front early is what I love to do.
That's really interesting. But you're right. I mean, I can't remember the particular statistics, but I know from a cybersecurity perspective, the vast bulk of breaches or issues are actually human error, aren't they? They're not.
Absolutely.
They're not failures of the tech.
Absolutely. And there's also the connection of those security teams in with development teams and the rest of the organisation. Fascinating space.
Yeah, absolutely. And not one I'd immediately connect with organisational psychology. So Stella, you sponsor an initiative.
It's a not-for-profit.
A not-for-profit in Victorian ICT, which aims to increase female participation in IT. And you talked about a study tour that you're going on, looking at a whole lot of interesting things. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so I think STEM is such an important part of our progression as humans, and I think technology is very much a game changer at the moment.
Yeah.
I think that women should know that their skills and perspectives are wanted and needed in technology.
Yeah.
And seeing young girls in this space, I think, is really important. From a personal example, I have a 9-year-old daughter, Alessandra, and she came to me last year sometime, and she said, "Mum, look, I'm keen to do Bricks for Kids after school." And Bricks for Kids is a robotic Lego program.
Yeah. Awesome.
Oh, okay, fair enough. If you've got the interest, we'll give it a go. So, term 1, I love this. Term 2, yeah, I really like this. Term 3, yeah, it's okay. But as we're heading into term 4, don't think I really want to go back. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? How did we get from I love this to I don't want to go back? And so the poor little girl, after many, many, many questions from me, what I did understand was that in term 1 and term 2, there were 2 instructors in the room, one male, one female. Alessandra was one of 15 children, 14 of the others were boys. So that in and of itself is interesting.
It is.
But
it is.
I think that having that female instructor in the room was critical to potentially integrating Alessandra into team formation, someone to go to with questions, etc. And possibly also being a role model.
That whole you can be what you can see element?
Yeah, potentially, that's right. And so what happened in term 3 was that the female instructor, for some reason, stopped going. And it was only the male instructor. And I'm not sure whether that person just didn't do the job of integrating as well, didn't understand the importance of being able to do that potentially. But I think that was a really large contributor to the exit. And so, linking it back to our work, I think that having women in leadership positions within technology is really important to the stickiness of participation, particularly for our young and emerging and upcoming female talent. And that's where I'd love to be able to do more and support organisations who are doing more in that space. And so when the opportunity came up to go on a study tour next year to Silicon Valley, to go through the tech giants and some of the universities and understand this further, I absolutely put my hand up, and I'm really looking forward to see, what's working over there, and what we can potentially bring back and apply here.
So are they ahead of where we are?
Well, that's a really good question. To be honest, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't think that necessarily they would be. The reason I say that is because at the last cybersecurity conference that I was at, one of the partners from Accenture spoke and noted that she was surprised and pleased to see the female level of participation in the cybersecurity space here in Australia.
Okay.
And so, if you think about that as a bit of a litmus
She was
test,
US based?
She was US based,
okay.
yeah. And, but does works globally.
Yeah,
and
sure.
so if you think of that as a small litmus test, then who knows? We might actually be a step ahead. But but I think it's one of those things that we've got to stay on top of and actually grow further and more.
Yeah. That sounds like a really interesting study tour. And one of my favourite parts of the world. We might have to have another conversation when you're back from that.
Yes, I'll look for some tips.
Absolutely. So Stella, one of your numerous titles is that you are a co-CEO, and I have to say that's not a term I've heard much at all. You're a female-led organisation, and you have explained to me that when you were setting up the organisation, you were advised not to go down that route of co-CEO, advice that you decided to ignore.
Yeah, it's unique, isn't it? We're co-founders and we're co-CEOs, and we make it work, and that's okay. It works for us. We share the lead with complementary styles, and we have a core set of shared values, and I think that's the really important piece. My business partner Joe and I see as a Venn diagram. We're both mothers of young girls, and we're both nurturing a young business. We're busy, and we've got each other's backs, and I don't think that I ever have it all. There's always sacrifices that I'm making, either at home or at work, and that's okay. I think behind each one of those choices, I know that there's a sacrifice, and there's also comfort in knowing that Joe and I are in the same boat, and we're each other's life rafts to a certain degree. We share the leadership role where we're both across the bigger issues and we divvy out the smaller ones. We respectfully disagree with each other, and we trust our advisory board when we get stuck. We've built a solid platform of governance in our business, which means that we can simply get on with the business of being in business. And that for us has created really good confidence going into the next decade. Yeah,
sure. Why do you think the advice that you received was not to take that path?
I think that I don't think it was bad advice necessarily. I think that
you respectfully disagreed with it.
Yes, that's right. I think that there's huge risks. If it's not done right. I think that you do need governance. I think governance is the key. I think that it needs to be structured to a certain degree so that there's clarity for people and clarity for you as a leader within this co-shared arrangement as well. And I think that at its basis is trust, that you have to have trust in each other in terms of your intent, in terms of your operations, for it to be able to work. And, I think Joe and I actually spoke to as many failed partnerships as we could before we set up.
Smart.
To understand what is it that went wrong, what is it that you would do differently, what happened. And most of the time, it was about trust.
Okay, well, and we read and increasingly talk about that in, all facets of life, but certainly in the business. In the business realm. Joe, you consider yourselves to be leaders in the gig economy with almost micro placements on projects. tasks, tapping into people who you've described as would otherwise be dormant. I'd really like to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, I call this our treasure trove of talent, and Joe finds this term hilarious, but I really like it because I think it speaks to how I feel about our team. And you know, this is a group of people who are incredibly talented. They've come out of big corporate roles or large consulting gigs, and for whatever reason, and the reasons vary, going back into that space doesn't work for them at this particular time, for whatever reason. And so many of them would potentially be economically dormant. And so to be able to mobilise them and get them really excited and inspired and engaged around projects is hugely rewarding.
Sure.
And I think that it's actually about making sure that they come together on their terms, in terms of what works for them, to be able, is it the right piece of work? Is it the right client and sort of technical background, and is it the right price? And this last notion around is it the right price is a really important one, because it's a defining characteristic of how we operate. And Joe and I are happy to take hits on our margin to be able to make sure we get that hygiene factor right, and that it's a part of our culture.
Okay. How do you, so you talked earlier about the fact that a lot of your team are based on site or working remotely. I personally have worked in virtual teams spread across multiple time zones, which can make having a great team culture quite challenging. How do you approach that?
Yeah, technology these days is amazing, isn't it? As you probably would have experienced. And my business partner Joe moved to Asia to establish our Asian operations, and so and it's been 7 months now. So, but interestingly, it makes no difference whether she's in our office in CBD, out with a client, at home, Bayside, Melbourne, or in South Korea, where there's only a couple of hours time difference.
Really?
So to be able to function as co-directors hasn't really been impacted. However, having said that though, with our broader team, we do need to orchestrate our culture. We have to consciously create it.
Okay.
And so we use a multiple series of tools to be able to do that. We use Google Hangouts for our project-based messenger chats. We use WhatsApp for our social and fun banter. We use things like traditional training sessions where we bring people together, and we make sure that we build in times where we physically, at least at a minimum on a quarterly basis, actually have a full day together.
Okay.
And so we stay on top of making sure that we connect, and that connection is actually a priority.
Okay, so a considered focus around
Absolutely.
that, not just that it's a byproduct
Yeah.
and fit in if the stars align.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I like the element with WhatsApp using, acknowledging that some fun and social silly banter is an important part of what makes up that that cohesive team.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. It goes back to what we were talking about before. We want to know more about our people beyond what work they're delivering for our clients.
Yeah,
we want to see the photos of the school concert and all those sorts of things.
My colleagues see plenty of that. In inverted commas, delighted several of them with my 8-year-old son's first hip hop concert last weekend with some fairly loud music blaring in the office on Friday afternoon, which garnered a few looks from teams sitting by us.
Love it.
But good fun. Now, Stella, that leads perfectly and unintentionally into the final topic that I wanted to discuss. So, building on a couple of the themes that have come up, bit more of a personal focus, this question. When we had a coffee recently to chat about this podcast and to shape some themes, we discovered that we had both had premature babies born at the same hospital and the same number of weeks gestation. And that led to a pretty long, pretty still emotional conversation, particularly when you consider that said babies are now 8 and 9. We talked earlier about bringing our whole selves to work. How did this experience influence you in your work?
Yeah, look, I've already, mentioned my daughter, and the reason is because I can't context my work without taking into consideration the entirety of my life experience. And for me, having a child was part of that. And having a very premature baby was a highly traumatic experience for me and my family, and it changed the course of my career. And so, I think soon after I went on to support the pioneering work of a paediatric neuropsychologist who was helping babies and families to intervene early on developmental issues. And so I worked with her to establish a charity, which I then chaired for a couple of years. And, for me, that was a personally therapeutic and hugely professionally rewarding experience. And ultimately, it's one of the influences that led me to where I am now. And at the end of the day, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else but where I am right now.
Yeah.
And I couldn't be more excited to be consulting in the people space at the moment. I think the last 20 years have created a great platform for incredible things, and the coolest stuff hasn't even been invented yet. And I really think that it's kind of almost the most important time in history for me to be doing the sort of work that I'm doing. And if I hadn't had those earlier experiences, then So I think that out of trauma and the curveballs that life throws at you sometimes, it takes some time, but you eventually land on your feet and do something with it.
Well, you clearly are, and you're doing a whole lot of really, really interesting stuff. Stella, thanks so much for your time today. It's been great.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to the Katie Talks podcast with me, Katie Bennett-Stenton. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone. And if you loved it, please give me leave some feedback on iTunes to help other people find this great content. I read all feedback and thoroughly enjoy it. We've got some excellent thought leaders coming up in the series. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And you can find me on Twitter at Katie B Marketing or on LinkedIn, Katie Bennett-Stenton.